We humans like to complain, especially when it comes to water. Too much, too little, too high, too low. Only 1% of the water on this planet is accessible to humans. But by all measurements, North Carolina has been given its fair share. Our state has 17 river basins. Some rivers flow north, some south, others west. Flowing east, a few rivers become very large before merging with the Atlantic Ocean. All 17 Tar Heel River basins receive more than 40 inches of average annual rainfall. Some areas in our Southwest receive up to 100 inches per year, qualifying them as temperate rainforest. Water has shaped North Carolina, our coastline, our highest peaks, and our magnificent gorges. The presence of water affects the size of our cities and their locations. Water can be angry and violent, and can change the landscape overnight. Water is also patient and can carve a gorge or valley over millions of years. Water has many different faces across the Tar Heel landscape. In our highest mountains, water arriving as mist or gentle rain can, within a short distance, become part of some of the most dramatic waterfalls in Eastern America. Much of the water in our mountains flows through deep organic soils and ancient rocks before emerging as some of the cleanest, clearest streams in America. In the Piedmont and mountains, streams and rivers are generally confined and restrained by rock formations that dictate the direction of flow and the width of the river. In the eastern part of our state, Tar Heel rivers are wide and flat because there are no rocky banks to restrict their flow. Water in the Piedmont and mountains is generally clear when not colored by sediments. Streams originating in eastern North Carolina in deep organic soils are clear, the color of iced tea. This deep amber-colored water in in eastern streams and rivers is known as blackwater. For many reasons, including power generation, flood control, and recreation, streams and rivers have been dammed, forming major man-made lakes from the Tennessee border through our mountains and across the Piedmont. We have lakes with high dams and thousands of acres of impounded water. Dotting our landscape are also countless farm ponds of less than an acre in size. In eastern North Carolina, there are very few large man-made lakes, but many natural lakes, including the mysterious Carolina Bays. Abundant water is the reason for our dense green forest, found in all 100 counties. Unlike most areas of the country, North Carolina also has adequate water to sustain farming operations anywhere in the state. Over many millennia, consistent weather patterns and rainfall are responsible for the extraordinary biodiversity found in North Carolina. We have water to thank for our 265 species of freshwater fish, and 60 species of salamander, but the same water is also responsible for dramatic wildflowers from spring until first frost. With a population of more than 10 million people, we ask water to do many things. Keep our forests green, sustain agricultural production, allow us to have lush green lawns, provide recreational opportunities, and cool the turbines that power our industry. As if by magic, we want the water on our coast to be clean enough to swim in and produce seafood for our table. We ask a lot of North Carolina's water. Finally, between the fresh water of the mainland and the salt water of the open ocean, North Carolina is home to one of the largest estuarine systems in America, made of part fresh water and part salt water. These estuaries are surrounded by salt marshes, which are the nurseries for countless finfish and shellfish. These waters and the marshes that surround them are also home to numerous species of birds, both summer and winter. Are we asking too much of our water resources? Have we begun to take water for granted the way we once assumed that forests could not be depleted, that there would always be ducks and geese in the sky, and that ocean fish stocks could not be dented?
There is no more important topic than water in North Carolina, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. With the help of distinguished guests, Exploring North Carolina is going to examine some of the hard questions regarding our use and stewardship of water resources.
Ryan Boyles has served as North Carolina's state climatologist and is now Deputy Director of the Southeast Science Climate Center of the U.S. Geological Survey. Jim Fox is Director of the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center at UNC Asheville, dealing with climate issues affecting North Carolina and the nation. I asked Ryan Boyles and Jim Fox where North Carolina's water comes from and how much we normally receive each year.
All of the moisture that we experience here in North Carolina, rain, our streams, our lakes, it all originates from much further south, from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Caribbean Sea. And our prevailing winds are from the south. As that air blows over the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, moves up across the southeast and into the Carolinas, it brings along all of that moisture. So in North Carolina, we have widespread regular rainfall month after month, year after year, on the order of about 50 inches on average, because of all that moisture that comes up from the Gulf of Mexico. And in North Carolina, we have three distinct regions. Now along the coast, they get a little more rain on average because they're a little closer to the water. They have more sea breeze events and more tropical storms and rainfall from those events. In the mountains, because of those mountain ridges and elevated areas, as the moisture comes up from the south, it hits those mountains, it gets elevated, it cools off, and then produces a lot of rainfall, especially on those exterior ridges and mountain slopes. So areas like Brevard, Lake Toxaway, they get in excess of 80 inches a year. In the Piedmont area from Charlotte along the I-85 corridor through the Triangle area, they get approximately 40 inches on average too.
Earth can be looked at as the water planet, right? The majority of our planet, really, the surface is water. But there's only a very small percentage of that that's actually fresh water. And then the fresh water that's available to us here in the state of North Carolina is also then limited. That when you start looking at how the water cycle works, that, rain falls, comes onto the ground, flows into the rivers, goes to the sea, but also as the sun hits the ground, it evaporates the water, puts it back into the water cycle, so that when we start looking at this finite system of the water cycle, we really have to rely on what is falling from the air, the precipitation, for us to be getting our drinking water.
I ask our experts how North Carolina's water supply stacks up when compared to the rest of the country and the world.
North Carolina is blessed, especially from the idea of water quantity. North Carolina receives, on average, about 50 inches of rain a year across the state. And, when you start looking at that, that means we get more than, say, the Midwest and Iowa corn grower. They only get about 40 inches of rain per year. If you then look at us compared to the Southwest United States, we're getting 2 to 3 times what they do for our western neighbors. And then if you start comparing that to the rest of the globe, this 50 inches of rain that we get a year, that's a real abundance. And you can see that then by just what happens in the state of North Carolina. The blessing that we have of all the trees, the forest cover that we have, is a direct relationship to this large quantity of water that we receive.
So North Carolina, relatively speaking, is a very water-rich state. We have regular rainfall season after season, year after year, but there are variations, and sometimes those variations can be substantial. So what we think of as drought around here, folks in Arizona may laugh at. For us, a drought may be annual rainfall of only 30 inches a year, as opposed to places of the desert Southwest that may get only 4 or 5 inches a year. For us, drought is a lack of moisture to meet all of the different needs for the water. So it's not just how humans use the water, it's not just the water that's in the rivers and the lakes, but it's also all of the lush plant communities that utilize all of that moisture that comes in. So when we get dry for a few months, we do see some mild drought impacts, and we can see implications for plant stress, as well as the wildlife and our reservoirs and our water supplies. But relatively speaking, we still have so much more moisture to work with than a lot of communities in the U.S. and around the globe.
How did water affect early settlement in North Carolina? And what did abundant water mean to travelers? No one knows more about early roads and transportation in North Carolina than Tom Magnuson, founder of the Trading Path Association in Hillsborough. In keeping with the topic, we met Tom at Fuse Ford on the Eno River.
Crossing streams, because of the geography of the southeast, is a daily task. You can't move very far anywhere in North Carolina without stepping over a creek of some size. I once counted the number of named watercourses between Petersburg and the North Carolina line was 236 or something like that, and the number of rivers between Chesapeake Bay and Georgia is 26 major streams. I guess the Southeast, as much as any place in the world, is totally tied to its water. Well, water is life.
The story of water in North Carolina is one of too much or too little. Many of us know the history of hurricanes in North Carolina and their impact on the North Carolina coast and Piedmont. Hurricanes Hazel, Fran, and Floyd are storms that come to mind for North Carolinians. We do not often think of hurricanes or tropical systems affecting the mountains of North Carolina. But western North Carolina was the site of one of the great floods in our recorded history. It was the Great Flood of 1916. Exploring North Carolina met with Jessica Bandel, North Carolina research historian in the Division of Archives and History, who recently finished a book on the Great Flood of 1916. Jessica astonished us with the power of this flood of 100 years ago.
What emerged after the water receded can be described as nothing short of apocalyptic. The remains of flood victims were found in trees, sometimes weeks after they were swept from their homes. Landslides completely covered the homes. Sometimes remains couldn't be recovered at all. Farmers' fields were completely washed away. In fact, one farmer in Linville Falls woke up the next morning to find that the North Fork of the Catawba River had cut a completely new channel right through his cornfield.
I asked Jessica to describe the origin and coverage of the Great Flood of 1916.
In mid-July 1916, the remnants of two hurricanes collided over the western region of the state, inundating the area with unprecedented rainfall. The rain fell from Asheville to the western edge of the Piedmont, inundating the area with anywhere from 10 to 22 inches of rainfall, with Altapass receiving a record-setting 22.22 inches of rain in one 24-hour period. This record still stands today. The terrain of the western region of the state greatly influenced the impact of this flood, given that the valleys and the mountainsides funneled the rain down through the valleys, sort of the hollers, if you will, into larger river streams like the Yadkin and Catawba rivers, Swannanoa, and the French Broad.
The damage described by Jessica Bandel is nothing short of biblical.
Residents woke on Sunday, July 16th in Biltmore Village to find water flooding into their first floor. Many of them taking refuge at the All Souls Church, slightly higher elevation for safety. At least 50 lives were lost in the course of the floods due to both drowning and landslides. The damages to infrastructure totaled in the millions of dollars. Telegraph lines were cut, paper routes were cut, railroads were cut, highways, road systems, all devastated, bridges were wiped out. It was very hard to move from community to community, and in fact, even doctors had a hard time responding to medical emergencies. There was at least a couple of deaths attributed to just a doctor not being able to get across the river. Along with us, 6 other states were impacted, but North Carolina suffered the most damages in terms of dollars and in terms of lives lost.
When you look at the forest in western North Carolina today, you must remember that conditions were much different in 1916. Logging across much of the western part of our state had exposed hillsides and valleys. When the storm system arrived in July 1916, the water ran across western North Carolina, much as water runs across a paved parking lot today. Without the benefit of vegetation to hold the land in place, flooding was magnified. Jessica Bandel tells the story.
The great irony of this flood was that the first southern Forest Congress was actually convening in Asheville at the time, from July 11th to July 15th. And one of the questions they sought to answer was striking a balance between conservation efforts and private industry, especially as it regarded to logging. At the beginning of this Congress, Governor Locke Craig addressed the room saying that the timber industry needed some kind of regulation. He actually invited attendees to go down to the French Broad and look at the flooding that was then occurring, which he didn't know at the time would only become worse, pointing to the clear cutting of the timber industry as one of the main reasons for the flooding that had been just started as the conference convened.
Today, when you look at the rich forest across western North Carolina, in places like Asheville's watershed, between Black Mountain and the Blue Ridge Parkway, conditions are far better than they were in 1916. Forest buffers will not stop all flooding, but they will reduce the severity of future floods. As we celebrate water in North Carolina and examine the history of water in this state, we ask two of North Carolina's most prominent citizens, Governor Roy Cooper and Commissioner of Agriculture, Steve Troxler, to tell us how important water resources were to quality of life in their early years and their memories of how water shaped their lives.
You know, my dad, I consider him an early conservationist. And I remember taking long walks with him across the farm, into the woods, along the streams. My dad wrote a book of stories growing up in the Depression on that farm, and he called it Between the Creeks, because that's where Big Saponi Creek and Little Saponi Creek merged in Nash County. He would tell me about how important it was that we save this land and our water and conserve for my generation and the generations ahead. But just remember, in everything we do, that we're leaving this land and water to our kids and our grandkids and future generations, and we have a responsibility. And I think that sparked me ending up running for the legislature and being involved in public policy.
You know, I grew up basically on my grandfather's farm here in Brown Summit, and always was outside, enjoying the natural resources, the trees, the soil, the water. So, you know, very quickly, as I grew up, I learned how important water was, not only to everyday life, but also to crops. Going back through history, if you look at the Dust Bowl days and its effect on not only lives in the Midwest, but other parts of the United States, and we began to realize that conservation practices were very, very important to the farm. And my grandfather was a tobacco farmer, and in 1953 we had a massive drought here in this area, and none of the crops made anything. And I can remember the stories of the first precipitation that we saw fall was snow. That gives you a deep appreciation of water and its importance not only to the human being, to the crops that grow, and to the wildlife. So it's been a full lifelong process to understand clean water and abundant water resources. And that realization ended up in me in college at NC State and ending up with a degree in conservation.
In coming episodes, we will tell you more about North Carolina's watery heritage and the challenges facing us in the face of development and a growing population. And we learned this while exploring North Carolina.